Tain Plantation rose like a gleaming white crown against the steaming swamps of South Carolina's low country. From a distance it looked like a palace, its marble white columns reaching skyward like pillars of prayer, shimmering under the relentless southern sun. But beneath that polished perfection, the wood groaned with secrets. For every beam that held its roof, a story of cruelty and sin was nailed into its heart. It was the summer of 1836. Charleston was a city divided by wealth and conscience, where women wore silk and men traded souls. And in every ballroom, on every veranda, one name was spoken with admiration and envy: Mrs. Elle Lanena Tain. They said no plantation prospered like hers. They said God had blessed her fields, her fortune, her family. But if they had walked behind her mansion, past the manicured roses and the whispering willow trees, they would have seen something else. Something no one dared speak of. 3 winters earlier, Elle Lanena had buried her husband, Colonel William Tain, a man of iron authority and cold eyes. His death had come suddenly, struck down by fever or perhaps by fate. Most widows in those days faded quietly into the background. But Elle was not like most women. In widowhood, she had not weakened. She had sharpened. Under her rule, production doubled. Her slaves worked harder, longer, under stricter supervision. The rice mills thundered through the nights and the ledgers overflowed with profits. Charleston's elite were astonished. "Mrs. Tain," Judge Heil had said at a summer dinner, glass raised in toast, "you continue to astonish us all. Your cotton yield surpasses every estate from here to Pinckney's." Elle smiled faintly, her lips painted crimson against her pale skin. "God provides," she murmured, "for those who provide for themselves." The guests laughed softly, unaware of the ice beneath her words. They saw a graceful widow, elegant, devout, and composed. What they didn't see was how she provided for herself. When the laughter faded and the last carriage disappeared into the humid night, Elle retreated to her private study. The air inside smelled of wax, ink, and iron. On her desk lay ledgers, neat and organized, each line, each number representing a human life reduced to profit. She dipped her quill in ink and began to write, the scratch of metal on parchment echoing through the silence. A knock came at the door. "Enter," she said without looking up. The overseer, Silas Webb, stepped inside, a hulking man with a sunburnt neck and guilt in his eyes. He twisted his hat nervously in his hands. "The new girl's here, ma'am," he said. "Came in from the Dalton auction. Strong and healthy. Should fetch a good price once she's bred." Elle didn't glance up. "Have Dr. Parnell examine her in the morning. I won't pay a premium for barren stock." Her words were calm, precise, like numbers in a ledger. Silas hesitated. "And about Mercy, ma'am. She gave birth this morning. A healthy boy." That made Elle look up. Her eyes, cold and sharp as winter glass, flickered briefly with satisfaction. "Excellent," she said. "That makes 3 this month. Tell the traders from Georgia they may have them by next week." Silas nodded, though something in his throat seemed to tighten. He turned to leave, but paused. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. Mercy's not from the fields. She's your daughter's handmaid." Ella's voice dropped to a whisper that froze the air. "I am aware of who she is. You will not speak of it again." The overseer bowed his head and left. Outside, the cicadas screamed through the dark, as if warning the earth itself to remember what had been said. What Silas did not know, what no record would ever show, was that Mercy had been forced. Ordered by her mistress to bear a child that would never know freedom, its lineage erased from existence. In the world of Elle Lanena Tain, birth was not a miracle. It was an investment. Every life began in debt and ended in silence. Upstairs in the East Wing, 3 young women prepared for bed, Elle's daughters, the living ornaments of her wealth. Caroline, the eldest at 22, stood by the window, her pale hands resting on the sill. She gazed across the moonlit fields toward the slave quarters, her other hand unconsciously drifting to her stomach. Josephine, age 20, sat at her vanity, writing furiously in a journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Her pen scratched secrets no one would read, and Beatrice, the youngest, just 17, lay curled on her bed, weeping softly. Her mother had told her that her 18th birthday would bring a great honor to the family. But in the Tain mansion, honor was a word that carried the scent of blood. None of them knew that outside. Among the shadows of the live oak grove, someone was watching. His name was Isaiah, a tall, Silent man with the strength of a field hand and the eyes of someone who had seen too much. 3 months earlier, his sister had vanished after being sold to the Tain estate. Rumors whispered through the quarters about the breeding house, a windowless building hidden behind the main gardens. Isaiah had arranged to be sold here deliberately. Not for work, not for money, for revenge. He crouched in the darkness watching the mansion glow with candlelight, listening to faint echoes of laughter and piano music from the upper floors. He swore under his breath that before the summer ended, he would find his sister, or die trying. The breeding house itself was nothing more than a converted barn, its wooden walls heavy with humidity and the stench of sweat. Inside, a midwife moved between narrow cots where women lay weak from childbirth. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. Babies cried softly in the night, then fell silent when hands took them away. No one spoke. No one dared. At the center of it all hung a brass bell on a rope, used not to summon help, but to signal birth. That night the bell rang once, then again, and each ring echoed through the plantation like a toll for the dead. From her study, Elle Lanena heard it faintly and paused her writing. For a brief moment something flickered behind her expression. Fatigue, perhaps sorrow, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She dipped her quill again and returned to her ledger. Numbers mattered. Feelings did not. The following morning, the Tain Plantation awoke to another day of perfect order. The sun rose blood orange over the rice fields. Overseers barked commands. Slaves moved like shadows through the mist. To any visitor, it looked like paradise, prosperous, peaceful, divine, but those who lived within knew better. They had seen too much, heard too much. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. At night, whispers crept through the corridors, voices that didn't belong to the living. Servants said that sometimes, when the moon was full, the cries of infants could be heard coming from the old oak grove, long after the bell had stopped ringing. That same morning, Beatrice found her sister Josephine sitting on the balcony, her journal clutched tightly. "What are you writing?" Beatrice asked softly. "Nothing," Josephine replied, hiding the book. "Just thoughts. About Mother?" Josephine hesitated, then nodded. "Don't you ever wonder what Father would think? If he saw what she's become?" Beatrice looked down. Father was no better. They both fell silent. The air between them grew heavy, filled with memories neither dared name. By afternoon, Elle Lanena appeared in her riding habit, black velvet, polished boots, a woman in command of everything she surveyed. She rode across her fields like a queen surveying her kingdom, her posture unbent, her gaze unflinching. Workers froze when she passed. Even the wind seemed to bow. She was, in every sense, the perfect southern widow, powerful, poised, and terrifyingly alone. But the perfection of her world was cracking, and she didn't yet know it. That night, when she returned from her ride, she found her study door ajar. Inside, one of her ledgers lay open. A page was missing, torn cleanly from the book. She stared at the empty space for a long time, the candlelight trembling across her face. Then slowly she smiled. "So," she whispered, "someone thinks they can play with me." Outside, thunder rumbled across the horizon. In the oak grove, Isaiah hid the torn page beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters. It was the first proof he had found, the list of women taken from the auctions, their names replaced by numbers. His sister's name was not there, but he knew now that she had existed, and that meant she could still be found. That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows. Lightning turned the white mansion blue for brief, violent moments. In her room, Caroline clutched her stomach and whispered prayers. Josephine hid her journal, terrified that her mother might discover it. Beatrice dreamed of running away, though she didn't yet know where to run. Down below, in the breeding house, another bell rang. And in the dark, Isaiah whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I go inside." The Tain Plantation slept beneath the storm, unaware that history itself was shifting in the shadows. The sins that built its fortune were stirring, restless and alive, waiting for the moment to rise from the dirt and drag everything white, polished and holy, down into the mud where it belonged. The year was still 1834, but after the Sullivan arrest, Virginia had turned into a graveyard of whispers. The house on the hill, once filled with the laughter of children, now stood silent, surrounded by frost and fear. A heavy mist rolled across the valley every morning, clinging to the broken windows and rotting fence posts like pale fingers. Locals called it The breath of the children, no one went near the Sullivan property anymore, except the men from the county investigation office, men who thought they were walking into a crime scene. They were wrong. They were walking into a nightmare. Sheriff Amos Lee led the team that day. 5 men, armed not with courage, but with orders. As they approached the main door, the sound of the old windmill creaked overhead, spinning slowly, as if groaning under the weight of something unseen. The door itself was swollen from moisture, yet opened with an ease that made every man hesitate. It was as if someone, or something, had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick and sweet, like rotting flowers left too long in a coffin. Their boots echoed on the wooden floorboards, and with every step, dust rose like ghosts of what once was. The walls were covered in children's drawings, stick figures, sun, moon, stars, and something else. Symbols, circular, jagged, drawn in a dark, rusty color. Sheriff Lee touched one with his gloved hand. It flaked like dried blood. In the far corner of the hallway stood a single rocking chair, moving back and forth ever so slightly. Though no wind entered the house, one of the men, Deputy Carter, whispered, "Sir, do you feel that?" The sheriff frowned. "Feel what?" Carter hesitated. "The floor, it's breathing." They paused, and in that pause came the first sound, soft, faint, impossible. A child's voice, not crying, not laughing, whispering. It came from beneath the floorboards. Every man froze. No one spoke. Then came another whisper. Then 2. Then 4. Like a dozen mouths murmuring from under the house, forming words that didn't belong to any language they knew. Lee raised his lantern, its light trembling as his hand shook. "Lift it," he ordered. The men pried the boards open one by one, the old nails screaming as they came loose. And under that floor, they found something that turned every drop of blood to ice. A tunnel. Narrow, circular, dug by hand, leading into darkness. And on its dirt walls, more of those same symbols, but this time carved deep, like the earth itself had been branded. They went down with lamps, one at a time. The tunnel smelled of salt and something older, something like forgotten air. At the end of it was a small chamber. Inside, half buried in the dirt, was a box, a small wooden chest with a lock shaped like an eye. "Break it," Lee said. Deputy Carter struck it with his crowbar. Once, twice, and until the wood split. Inside was a diary, wrapped in lace so fragile it turned to dust when touched. The diary of Constance Sullivan. Its first page was dated January 2nd, 1834. The handwriting was elegant, but trembling. "Ezra says the voices are gifts. He says they come from the other side, where our children will never die. But last night the whispers grew louder. They said my name. They told me the exchange was incomplete." Lee turned the page. "I saw them. Beneath the floor. Their eyes were gone, but they could still see me. Ezra says it's part of the ritual, the white exchange, a promise that life can be traded for silence." By the time he reached the 3rd page, the ink had changed color, no longer black but brownish red. And the final words, half-faded, read, "Do not open the white door. It doesn't lead outside. It leads below," Carter whispered. "Sir." "What white door?" Lee looked around, his lamp swinging in shaky circles, until it landed on something they hadn't noticed before. A small, white-painted door in the far wall of the tunnel, no bigger than a cupboard. It was sealed shut with iron nails. And yet from behind it came the faint sound of breathing. No one wanted to touch it, but curiosity, or fear, pushed Lee forward. He pulled the nails out one by one, each echo louder than the last. When the final nail dropped, the door slowly swung open. A rush of cold air burst through, blowing out one of the lamps. Darkness swallowed them, and from inside that darkness came a whisper, clear, cold, and terribly human. "You shouldn't have come back." The tunnel shook. The lamps flickered violently. One man screamed. They all ran. By the time they reached the surface, Carter was gone. Only his lantern was found, but still burning, lying beside the open hole. Later that night, Sheriff Lee wrote his report. He mentioned strange voices and unexplainable drafts, but the diary, he never turned it in. Instead, he locked it inside his office desk. A week later, his house burned down, with the desk still inside. No remains were ever found. And so, The whispers beneath the floor never truly stopped. Locals say if you walk past the Sullivan ruins at midnight, you can still hear those voices, counting, waiting, and whispering for someone new to take their place. The news of what was found beneath the Sullivan house spread like wildfire through Virginia. Newspapers printed extra editions, pastors rewrote their sermons, and even the governor's office sent men to contain the hysteria. But hysteria could not be contained. The town of Roanoke Hollow was already possessed, not by ghosts, but by curiosity and fear. People whispered that the earth itself had turned against them, that the soil beneath the Sullivan home was cursed, and that anyone who stepped upon it would hear the cries of the buried. By the time April 1834 arrived, every road into town was lined with wagons. Outsiders came from miles away to witness the trial. Preachers, farmers, scholars, even a few writers hoping to capture America's darkest crime. In the heart of that frenzy stood the courthouse, a stone building stained with soot, its bell tower cracked, its air thick with humidity and judgment. Inside, the trial began at dawn. Constance and Ezra Sullivan were brought in under heavy guard. Their wrists were shackled in iron, and their clothes still bore the ash marks from the night their house burned. Ezra looked calm, almost regal. His posture was straight, his eyes steady. Constance, however, was a ghost of herself. Pale, trembling, lips moving silently as if reciting prayers no one else could hear. The courtroom was packed to suffocation. The air smelled of sweat, candle wax, and ink. The townspeople craned their necks to see the monsters who had murdered children. Mothers held handkerchiefs to their mouths. Even the judge's gavel trembled slightly as he struck it against the bench. Ezra and Constance Sullivan, Judge Elias Thorne began. You stand accused of 47 counts of murder, unlawful imprisonment, and desecration of human remains. How do you plead? Ezra leaned forward, his voice low but clear. We do not plead, Your Honor. We testify. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor, a red-faced man named Whitaker, slammed his hand on the table. Testify? You will confess. But Ezra smiled. Confession is for those who believe they have sinned. We merely followed the design. Whitaker turned to the jury. You see madness. Complete madness. He opened a ledger and began reading from the sheriff's report. 47 children found beneath the Sullivan house, starved, beaten, their mouths sewn shut. Some bodies dating back years, and not a single record of their burial. He slammed the ledger shut. How do you justify this, Mr. Sullivan? Ezra looked to the judge. They were not murdered. They were chosen. A gasp swept the room. Constance began whispering rapidly, her eyes fixed on something above the judge's head. They're watching, she murmured. The ones below. The judge rapped the gavel. Silence! Ezra only smiled wider. You can't silence them. The floorboards have already cracked, haven't they? For a moment, Judge Thorne froze, because in that instant, faint, barely audible, a knock echoed from somewhere beneath the courtroom floor. The crowd went still. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. The sheriff rushed to inspect the boards but found nothing. Still, no one could shake the feeling that something was moving under the ground. The rest of the trial blurred into chaos. Witnesses came forward with trembling voices. One claimed she'd seen the children's faces pressed against the Sullivan windows at night. Another swore that when the sheriff's men broke through the cellar, every candle in the house went out, as if something had drawn the air from their lungs. When it was Constance's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her chains rattling like distant bells. You think they are gone, she said softly. But they live where the light cannot reach. They have been patient, the prosecutor shouted. Patient? You buried them alive! Constance turned to him, eyes glowing with tears. Not buried, she whispered. Planted. Judge Thorne slammed the gavel again. Enough of this witchcraft. But Ezra raised his voice calm as ever. You will see, Your Honor. When the white door opens, all debts will be settled. The storm arrived that night, the kind that splits the sky like God's own punishment. Rain battered the courthouse roof, lightning illuminated the walls, and thunder rolled like drums of war. The jail below the courthouse flooded ankle deep. Guards reported flickering lanterns and cold spots that made their breath visible. Some swore they heard the sound of children laughing, faint, echoing, impossible. At midnight, a guard named Miller went to check on the Sullivans. When he reached their cell, both stood perfectly still, eyes rolled white, whispering in unison. The exchange is complete. The white door opens for all. Then the lights went out. When dawn came, the Sullivans were gone. No broken locks, no footprints, just two empty chains hanging from the wall, swinging softly as if moved by an unseen breeze. The trial was declared cursed. Judge Thorne tried to continue, but strange things began to happen. Files went missing, ink turned red overnight, and the court stenographer vanished on his way home. Days later, a book appeared on the judge's desk, Constance Sullivan's diary. He hesitated to open it, but curiosity devoured him. The first page was blank. On the second, new writing appeared before his eyes. The children were never buried. They were taken below. When the white door opens, judgment follows. That same night, the courthouse burned to the ground. Witnesses claimed they saw small shapes moving inside the flames, dozens of them, hands pressed against the glass, eyes glowing like lanterns. The fire consumed everything. When the embers cooled, they found only ashes, the judge's cracked gavel, and a single iron key, shaped like an eye. Months later, the land was sold. The buyer was a wealthy colonel named William Tain, who claimed the stories were superstitious nonsense. His wife, Elle Lanena, disagreed. She insisted the land had history worth preserving. When the workers began rebuilding, they uncovered something strange. A small white door beneath the parlor floor, just as the diary had described. The colonel wanted it sealed, but Elle Lanena whispered, "Some doors should never be closed." And so the Tain Plantation rose upon cursed soil, its marble walls gleaming in the sun, its gardens filled with laughter and wealth. But beneath it all, something ancient stirred, waiting, counting, remembering. Because the Sullivans had not vanished, they had simply changed their name. The year was 1839. 3 years had passed since the courthouse burned, and the memory of the Sullivan trial had begun to fade, at least for those who wished to forget. In South Carolina's low country, the Tain Plantation now stood as a symbol of prosperity. The mansion gleamed white beneath the sun, its columns tall and pure, its gardens alive with music and laughter. But beneath that brightness lay something restless. The soil was darker here, unnaturally rich, and whenever the wind swept across the rice fields, it carried with it a faint whisper, as though the ground itself was remembering. Inside the grand halls, life continued in perfect rhythm. Mrs. Elle Lanena Tain ruled her estate with an iron hand and a polite smile. To her guests, she was elegance incarnate, a woman of discipline and grace. Yet at night, when the candles dimmed and the servants retired, her mask slipped. She would sit alone in her study, eyes fixed on the ledgers that tracked every birth, every sale, every child that entered or left the breeding house. The numbers had made her rich, but they also began to haunt her dreams. Sometimes, in those late hours, she swore she could hear the sound of crying beneath the floorboards. Soft, distant, like something buried alive. She would stand motionless, listening, until the noise stopped. Then she would whisper to herself, "It's only the wood settling." But deep down, she knew the wood had never been that restless before. One evening, during a violent thunderstorm, a servant named Ruth came running into the main hall, soaked and trembling. "Mistress," she gasped, "something's wrong in the breeding house." Elle Lanena frowned. "Speak clearly, girl." Ruth swallowed hard. "The infants, ma'am, the ones that passed last winter, they're missing." Lanena's face went pale. "Impossible. They were buried near the east field." Ruth shook her head violently. "Not anymore. The graves are open, empty." Before dawn, Lanena and her overseer Silas rode to the site. Rain drenched the earth, washing away the topsoil, and there, in the mud, lay dozens of small open pits. No bodies, no traces, only tiny handprints pressed into the earth leading toward the mansion. Silas muttered a prayer. "Maybe animals dug 'em up." Lanena's voice trembled for the first time. "Animals don't leave handprints." That same night, the dogs refused to enter the east wing. Servants whispered of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and of children's laughter drifting through the walls. At first, Lanena silenced them with threats, but when her youngest daughter, Beatrice, woke screaming, claiming she saw a boy standing at the foot of her bed, covered in mud and smiling, even the mistress of Tain began to doubt her sanity. The following morning, she summoned the local priest, Father Anselm, a weary man with trembling hands and hollow eyes. He examined the property, murmuring Latin prayers as he moved from room to room. When he reached the study, he froze, "Mrs. Tain," he said softly, "did you build this house upon new land?" Lanena hesitated. It was purchased after a fire. The soil was fertile. The priest's face drained of color. "Not fertile," he whispered. "Consecrated. You built upon a grave." That night, as lightning tore across the sky, every mirror in the mansion cracked. The servants fled, screaming that they'd seen faces, dozens of them, reflected in the glass. Small, pale faces with eyes like burning coal. Lanena locked herself in her room, clutching a candle. She whispered prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Downstairs, the clock struck midnight. The storm paused. Silence swept across the plantation. And then, from deep beneath the floor came the sound. Faint at first, then growing louder. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm that once haunted the courthouse. Lanena stumbled to her feet, candle shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she called. No reply. Only the creak of the floorboards beneath her. Then came a voice, soft, childlike, and impossibly close. "We remember, Mrs. Tain." The candle blew out. Across the mansion, every door burst open at once. Windows shattered. The smell of soil filled the air, wet, heavy, suffocating. Servants screamed as small muddy footprints appeared on the marble floors, one after another, leading toward the main staircase. From the darkness below, dozens of figures began to rise, not running, not crawling, but walking steady and silent. The children had returned. Some were missing eyes, others mouths, but all were smiling, the same soft, knowing smile. They climbed the stairs slowly, their heads tilting in eerie unison, whispering the same words. The exchange is complete. The door is open. Lanena backed into the corner of her study, clutching her rosary. "No," she whispered. "No, I gave you life. I gave you purpose." A voice, neither male nor female, replied from the shadows. "You took ours." Lightning flashed. For an instant she saw them all, 47 children standing in a circle around her desk, their skin gray, their eyes glowing faintly white. At their center stood a taller figure, thin, familiar, Constance Sullivan, her face calm, her hands folded before her like a saint. Lanena dropped to her knees. "What do you want?" Constance smiled sadly. "Justice. The same you denied us." The house began to shake. Cracks tore through the ceiling. Dust rained down like ash. Outside, the storm screamed with unnatural fury. The candles exploded in bursts of wax and smoke as the floor split open, revealing the black earth beneath, shifting, breathing, alive. Lanena screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the sound, the deafening chorus of children's laughter and thunder and tearing wood. By morning, when the sun rose over the swamps, the mansion stood silent. The servants who returned found the house empty. No sign of Mrs. Tain, no sign of her daughters, only muddy footprints that led from the nursery to the study, and stopped at a single white door that no one remembered building. They tried to open it, but it would not move. That night, the door began to knock back, and those who stayed long enough to hear it swore they could make out voices from the other side, small, sweet, and endless. By the winter of 1843, the mansion on the hill had become more than a haunted home. It was a wound that refused to heal. The townsfolk whispered that the spirits of the 47 children had found no rest, and that every midnight, their faint cries still echoed beneath the broken floorboards. No one dared go near the Sullivan estate, until Father Callahan arrived. He was a man of silence and scripture, sent by the Archdiocese of Virginia to cleanse the unholy. His hands trembled as he first stepped through the front door. The air was colder than outside, thick like breathing through grief. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but underneath, he could feel the pulse of something alive, something ancient. As he began the rites, the candles flickered violently. A chill swept through the hallways. The crucifix around his neck grew heavy. He whispered in Latin, "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." But before he could finish, the door to the cellar creaked open on its own. Father Callahan descended. Step by step, each footfall echoed against the stone walls, mixing with faint whispers that seemed to come from within the very ground. "Leave," the voices said. "This is not your place." But he continued. At the bottom he found what the sheriff years ago had buried. The chains, the remnants of tiny shoes, and a mirror smeared with something dark. As he raised the cross, the reflection behind him shifted. A shadow standing tall, almost human. But wrong, it was Constance, or what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow yet burning, her mouth stretched as if screaming without sound. "You took them from me," she hissed, her voice echoing through every corner of the cellar. "You buried the truth with their bones." Father Callahan held his ground, chanting louder now, his voice trembling but determined. The mirror cracked. The floor began to shake. The sound of chains filled the room, louder, faster, until the ground split open, releasing a storm of screams and light. Outside, the mansion's windows shattered one by one. A column of fire shot through the chimney, and for the first time in years the cries stopped. When the sun rose, the Sullivan house was gone. Only ash remained, and a faint smell of burnt sage in the wind. Father Callahan was found unconscious near the road, his rosary melted into his palm. He survived, but never spoke again. And though the land was sold, rebuilt, and renamed, locals still say that on certain winter nights, if you walk past the hill and the fog is thick enough, you can still hear the faint sound of children laughing, not in fear but finally free. Decades passed. The Sullivan estate became just another ghost story, a tale told by grandmothers to scare their children into obedience. But in 1891, a young journalist named Eleanor Price arrived in Virginia, determined to uncover what really happened on that hill. She wasn't searching for ghosts, she was searching for truth. Armed with a notebook and a borrowed revolver, Eleanor began digging through dusty courthouse archives, old church records, and forgotten police reports. What she found didn't just chill her blood, it shattered everything she thought she knew about the Sullivan case. There had been no trial. No official report. The sheriff who led the investigation had vanished 3 weeks later, and the only surviving document, a torn confession written in ink and blood, was signed by Constance Sullivan herself. It read, "They took my children. They took my light. I only returned what they gave me in darkness." Eleanor realized that Constance was not the monster history had made her out to be. The children in the basement weren't victims of her cruelty. They were runaway slaves. Dozens of them, children born in chains, hidden away beneath her home to protect them from being hunted, beaten, or sold. She had given them food, shelter, and hope. But when local slave catchers discovered her secret, they burned the house and framed her for murder. The truth had been buried, literally, under the ashes of hatred. Eleanor's hands shook as she pieced it all together. The so-called evil mansion was never cursed by ghosts. It was cursed by guilt, the guilt of a society that couldn't face its own sins. She published her story in the Savannah Chronicle, and within days, it spread across the South like wildfire. Some called her a liar, others called her a saint. But one thing was certain: for the first time in 50 years, the name Constance Sullivan was spoken with tears, not fear. Months later, Eleanor returned to the hill where the mansion once stood. Only wild grass and the broken stones of a foundation remained. She placed a single white rose there, and as she turned to leave, a breeze whispered softly through the trees. "Thank you." She froze. No one was there, but in that moment, Eleanor knew the truth had finally set them free. And though the story of the Sullivan house faded again into legend, those who know the real history say that sometimes, when the fog rolls over the hill at dawn, you can still see a faint light in the mist, a woman standing by a window that no longer exists, watching the sunrise she never lived to see.